Hello. Tonight my guest is Mr. C. Herndon Williams, author of Texas Gulf Coast Stories. And what would you consider yourself, a local historian, Mr. Williams?
Actually, I think I'd consider myself more like a Texas storyteller, but a storyteller in the sense of true stories set in Texas history.
Give us your favorite story. Is that an unfair question?
No.
You know, we're on Karankawa Street, close to Karankawa Street here. 3rd, I believe, is right out here. It turns into Karankawa, and this is Santa Fe. So, one of your major topic was Karankawa Indians.
Yeah, all right. Here's a favorite title is Karankas were tall, tattooed, pierced, smelled awful, but weren't so bad.
Well, I don't know, because I read a little bit about them when you said that was one of your topics. They were between 6 to 7 feet tall. Is that correct?
Probably more like 6 feet tall.
6 to 7 feet is pretty tall.
I know some people say that.
Okay.
But the evidence, the archaeological evidence, bones that they've dug up in Refugio County and other places indicates, well, and that would be very tall for the time.
Well, it'd be unbelievably, what,
yes.
6 foot tall?
6 foot tall, let's say.
All right, so what does the word Karankawa mean?
I don't know what the word Karankawa means. It was back in the time when Texas was a Spanish colony. We're talking about in the 1700s. There were 5 bands of Indians closely related, okay? One of them was the Copains, Cojo, Cujanes. I forgot the 4th one, but the 5th one was Karankawa, or some variation of that. I mean, the street here spelled with a C. I spell it with a K. There's a number of other spellings. The Spanish were able to distinguish those bands very easily. Now, I'm not sure exactly how they were doing. I mean, they were separate bands, but over time, and by the time we're talking about is from the 1700s to about like 1820 maybe, the bands either may have coalesced due to disease or other population loss, and so we just got the name Karankawa that comes down to us. That's not what they call themselves.
And I don't mean to change subjects very quickly, but the subject of European immigration and of genocide of the Indian tribes and of mass slaying of Indians. So, about the Karankawas, was there a genocide? Was there murder of mass Indians?
No.
And that was my impression from my research, but okay.
Now, it's true that the Karankawas suffered population decline of 80 or 90%. Most of that had to do with European epidemic diseases like smallpox. There was some warfare between the Karankawas and others and with the Spanish authorities, but I haven't found any evidence of a genocide, although it's written about. I've seen other people assert
well, and I think there were certain, you could read certain atrocities and battles in Florida, etc., I guess.
In Florida?
Yes.
Well, the Karankawas were not in Florida.
Right. Well, I know, but I'm not speaking. I'm just speaking generally.
Oh well,
if you're just
that could be.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the how many of the men are married? How many maybe Mexican Americans or old Texas Americans are part Karankawa? Do you think? Well, I mean, I'm sure there was a certain amount of that just based upon the little bit I can tell about, you know.
All right. I'm interested in that topic, and I can't really say much about it except that I looked to see if there were Karankawas that entered Anglo society. Now, I have not run across anything about Anglos entering Tejano society, let's say before the Anglos got here. There was one account in a book of a Karankawa man that entered someplace in Texas. There was a woman named Mary Amaro, and that's one of the people that I've studied a lot. In one book, she said she was identified as the last Karankawa, and she married an Anglo guy of German descent.
So we know that we know that she intermarried and that they had children. So we know that.
But I researched that, and I found that she probably was not Karankawa. She might have been. She was identified as Hispanic at a certain point, and I know what her name of her parents were, Thomas and Casilda Amaro.
But can't we say, just not meaning to interrupt you, but can't we say, just generally speaking, that wherever the Spanish colonized, it seemed like generally they would interbreed with the indigenous tribes?
That certainly happened in Mexico.
Well, I mean, islands,
yeah,
et cetera.
I can't find any references to. I would be interested in that.
Yes.
And they may exist in Spanish someplace.
Right.
But I have not seen any references to that. If I saw such a thing, I would try to follow it up.
Okay.
But I can't I followed the one with the Mary Amaro because I thought, well, maybe it's true.
So let's talk about the traditional Western European notions that people think are so far, are so politically incorrect. Did these people, did they engage in polygamy, infanticide, killing of infants? Did they engage in incest? Did they engage in cannibalism? Those are the stereotypical things that the traditional Western European cultures would say, look, these people were pagan,
Well, they were certainly identified as pagan or savages by the Spanish missionaries who came in the 1700s. And the charge that's been hung on the Karankawas, long as I've heard, is cannibal. Now, among all the other things that you've mentioned, that's the only one that I can say I've come across.
Okay.
In fact, it's such a stereotype, let's say, that you throw up the word Karankawa, it's kind of like the word cannibal flashes at the same time. Now, were they cannibals? Yes. As far as I can tell, they were what I would call ritual cannibals. That is, they engaged in cannibalism with defeated enemies as part of a victory.
So they would kill the enemies and then eat them?
Parts of them, I think.
Yes. I would tell you from my limited knowledge of history, it's either in the Iliad or Odyssey, for example, where in the ancient Greeks engaged in ritualistic cannibalism. So even the more civilized Western peoples, which you would think of at that time, engaged in it pre-Christian. But they did engage in ritual cannibalism. There is one story that I read when you said you were an expert on Karankawa Indians about kind of one of these savage stories they were burning. They had somebody at the stake. They were maybe burning him at the stake, and they cut pieces off of him and roast him and eat that person in front of them. But it didn't seem to be totally proven. What's your opinion on that story? Horrible story, right?
Right. Well, so I can't doubt it. It's one of the first person. It is a first person account by a Spanish missionary who was making an inspection of the missions. I think it was around 1770. Okay, and he published that story in his report, and he got it from somebody. I don't know that he witnessed it himself, but he got it from somebody. Let me put one thing in here. Not that it's exactly all the Indian tribes in Texas at the time practiced ritual cannibalism. Okay? So the Karankawas were not unique in that, nor were they particularly, what's the word? Barbaric. I mean, it's barbaric for sure, but they're not at the end of the scale.
They didn't. When you say ritual cannibalism, I guess you're implying they did not eat other people to survive or as a source of food.
That's right. That is a distinction between ritual cannibalism. Now, there is a story that also comes up. Cabeza de Vaca, with a group of 80 other Spaniards, shipwrecked on a beach somewhere around Galveston Island. It may not have been Galveston Island, but it was around there. And this was in the winter. And over the winter, the Karankawas that were there, who were actually this cocoa band, helped them, fed them roots and nuts and some fish and so forth. Over the winter, a lot of the Spaniards died. I think there were only like 15 left in the spring. And the Spaniards resorted to cannibalism of each other, the dead ones that is, and the Coco were repulsed by it. So the Cocos, would not eat a member of their own.
I had read that also.
Yeah,
would not eat horrified.
Yeah, they were horrified. They wouldn't eat for sustenance, members of their own tribe. But going back to your thing about the Greeks, yes, it was known in Western society, and in some cases it wasn't ritual cannibalism.
And in my understanding, that under what was used to be termed the law of the sea, if there were 3 men on a raft, they would draw straws, and one of the men would be killed then, and the other 2 would be able to eat them. So I think is that true?
I don't know. I've never heard that story.
Well, and then of course there were the Andes survivors.
Yes,
wherein the people were. There was no evidence that they killed someone to eat, but they ate the people that died.
I think there was also the party at the Donner Pass.
The Donner Pass party. Yeah. I think that was similar.
Yeah.
So the Western people will eat each other if they need to, I guess.
Well, that seems
to be the pattern.
Seems to be the case.
So you're saying the ritual cannibalism is obviously then usually of the vanquished foes, etc.
Yeah. One of the reasons I was interested in the Karanka was I was also somewhat put off in that they have a very bad image now. Again, Karankawa cannibal. And so I spent a lot of time trying to get back to some first sources. And there's a lot of stories, first-person accounts, that indicate that they weren't particularly warlike or savage and so forth. However, by the time that, let's say, Stephen F. Austin and the Anglos came along, they were really their population had been decimated, and I think their culture had been fractured. So Stephen F. Austin didn't have much good to say about the Karankawas. They were pretty intractable by that time.
I see. But, and just to repeat what you're saying in a different way, then you're just saying basically maybe as a result of as a lifestyle being decimated, as their whatever social continuity interrupted, that they may have in fact been become much more dysfunctional, whatever.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, because they reached the point that they no longer had a viable population. Mm-hmm. They died at such great numbers that they just almost died off. I mean,
what about those who stated that the Europeans would intentionally inflict them with polio or something, or are there any?
No, that's I mean, that's I never read anything at all about that.
Indication of that.
I heard of a story. It goes up into the Midwest, someplace where a blanket or blankets infected with smallpox.
I think I heard those.
So it was different Indians.
Okay.
And when Stephen F. Austin came here in 1824. He tried to make peace, and was rather successful in making peace with the tribes around the San Felipe colony. But he was not successful with the Karankawas. They were pretty intractable by that time. And you could say it has to do with the population decline. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. But
maybe they grew a hatred of the Anglo-settlers.
Well,
that could very well be, or mistrust for well-stated reasons. So what did they eat if they didn't survive by eating each? No, that's terrible.
Well, they migrated from the coastline back and forth seasonally.
Our coast, the Gulf Coast.
Our Gulf Coast. Yeah, they were in a rather small extent from around like Galveston Island to around Baffin Bay, and generally didn't go more than like 50 miles from the coastline. And when they were inland, they would eat deer, squirrel, whatever they could get their hands on. When they were at the coastline, which was over the winter, oysters, fish, ducks, and so forth. They really lived a lot on seafood when they were at the coastline.
Was there buffalo here?
Actually, there were buffalo, and they could bring down a buffalo at that time. Yeah.
I hate this. I don't know how to say this. That sounds like kind of a nice lifestyle. Relaxed, doesn't it? Well, but maybe it was very hard. I don't know.
Well, they were very adapted to their environment, right. And they were a very, you might say, well, I was going to say the word primitive, but that you might think, well, all Indians are primitive, but no, even among groups of Indians, they were traditional or primitive. They were, another group might come along and say, boy, those guys really are primitive, And so they were traditional, but they were very well adapted to live in this stretch right here. But then when Anglos, well, the first ones that really came was La Salle. Cabeza de Vaca passed through, but ultimately it was only him and 3 other companions. So he didn't really occupy anything. But La Salle tried to establish a colony on Matagorda Bay in 1685. And so that's the first time anybody had tried to settle in their territory.
I see. One of the things I thought was interesting too about these Karankawa, I think they would shape their heads or something. Is that not true?
I don't think
so. You don't
think that? I haven't read anything on that. Yeah.
No, okay, flatheads or something.
No, there is at one time. I read some accounts that they were long-headed.
Okay.
But that's just the normal variation of. But they didn't do anything to cause that. We don't exactly know what they call themselves, but some of the other tribes around them call them dog lovers. They had apparently a small fox-like dog with no bark.
Is that right?
Yes, and they
call them chupacabras now.
Well,
without any fur on them or something. Without any, hair.
I haven't ever seen much of a description of the dogs, but they must have been there. I don't think they ate them either, but I don't know that for sure. But they had a reputation in terms of what other tribes called them, and one of them was dog lovers. Another one was walks without moccasins, because they went around barefooted with hardly anything else on. So,
what about, not meaning to change subjects, but what about other common things you think in cultures? Gender. Genders. Was there homosexuality? Was there divorce? Or how long did they live? Think questions like that. Those are interesting issues.
I don't know how long they lived. I would imagine it wasn't 30 or 40, something like that. They had marriage, but apparently, they weren't really studied as in an ethnographic sense.
Yes.
Until they were long gone. 1888 was the first report, and that had to go back. There was nobody left to interview, and the people that knew them well at the time, they were fairly secretive about that. They had marriage, but apparently it was, or something like it, but it could be dissolved. They were apparently very fond of children, extremely fond of children, their children. Or they were even fond of other people's children. When the La Salle colony was exterminated by the Karankawas in 1689, there were 5 French children there who were spared and adopted by the Karankawas. And they lived with the Karankawas for the next several years until the Spanish finally kind of, well, not tracked them down, but located them and ransomed them. And the Karankawas, when the French children were leaving, the Karankawas, were really sorry to see them go. So they were very, very fond of their children. And
well, so how did the Karankawas exterminate the LaSalle colony? How big was the LaSalle colony? And how did they exterminate them?
They just attacked them, I think, and killed them with, hatchets and bows and arrows and so forth. By that time, the LaSalle, what was left there, LaSalle took off and was trying to get back to the Mississippi River, and some followers that were in his party killed him over in East Texas. There were only about 30 or 40 colonists left back there, mostly women and children, and those are the ones that the Karankawas attacked and exterminated. That happened in 1688, I think. The Spanish had been looking for that colony because they claimed the land. They found the site about 6 months later, so 6 months too late. It was a kind of a tragedy that if the Spanish had found it sooner, they would have sort of captured the French that were left there, but really they would have rescued them, because as it was, there was nobody there by the time the Spanish finally found the site of LaSalle's colony.
And you're basically saying the children did bond with these Indians. These French children from that colony seemed to be sorry when they left, but that would be kind of natural. I guess it's, there's several reasons for that.
Yeah, the children were tattooed. The Karankawas had a characteristic way of tattooing. In fact, there's a picture of it in the book that somebody.
Now that tattooing has come back.
I know.
I'm just kidding. Yes and no. I don't know.
But anyway, now they were tattooed in a pretty tough way.
Well, describe the tattoos. Were they on their face?
The tattoos were. It was a stripe on the forehead, lines at the end of the eyes, 3 lines at the end of the mouth, and then something on the chin.
Women and men?
Yes, the women's tattoos might have been a little bit different, but they were pretty close. The men also, in addition to the tattooing, had a piece of bamboo that they used, and they pierced both of their nipples on their chest, and they wore the bamboo.
That doesn't sound too comfortable.
No, and the tattooing
practical,
was not very. The tattooing was done with like a porcupine quill or a thorn, and you dip it in the soot of the fire, and you put it under the skin.
Oh, well, that's it. That's quite a story there. So we were talking. You had mentioned this. What is it, cabeza de vaca? And you had talked about how they had he'd engage in cannibalism to stay alive after a shipwreck or something, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then I think that you know quite a bit about him also. Is that right?
Well, I did spend a lot of time looking into his time here. I mean, it's quite a story. He more or less. It took him 6 years from the shipwreck to get back into Mexico. And he kind of did it the hard way. He didn't go over and go down the eastern coast of Mexico. He walked all the way over to the Pacific coast. But most of the time, Cabeza de Vaca spent with the band, let's say, around the Galveston area. There was one guy that was afraid of water, and so Cabeza de Vaca kind of stayed back with him for a long time. But the Cocos or Karankawas there were at war with or at odds, let's say, with the other tribes around. So they would send Cabeza de Vaca out as a trader, as a trader, to do trade with the other groups. And so Cabeza de Vaca did that, and then at one point they went, in a certain season, they went to a place where they ate the tunas on a prickly pear. There was a place out, well, it was inland from there.
That's that like red blossom.
Yes, right, yeah.
You would eat those?
And they're called tunas.
I think people still eat them.
Yeah, they do. They're not,
I've never had
nopalitos is
nopalitos is a little different, I think.
Yeah,
but,
well, it may be a little bit, but it's basically the same thing. And so when they went there, Cabeza de Vaca met, I think, 3 other guys that were survivors of the same group. They'd gotten separated. Anyway, they were with separate bands. They all got there. And this was after they'd been there about 5 years or so. And they said, we're going to make a break for it. And so they just headed west. Without a guide, without food or anything. But they were aided along the way. After they got away, they were in some place, and some people were sick. Some of the Indians were sick, and they came to Cabeza de Vaca and said, can you help us? Can you make them well? Well, he didn't know what to do, So he said Christian prayers over them and blew on them, and they got well.
Oh, that's quite a story. My understanding, as an aside, a little bit I read, because you said you knew a lot about Cabeza de Vaca, was that he was in slavery several times, right?
Yeah,
and that goes against what we think of as traditional slavery, by being in the more native groups, etc. So how did that happen? How does that happen?
I don't have much information on that. It is true. I mean, Cabeza de Vaca kind of sort of went up and down. That is, he worked for a while as a trader for one group, but then when he got kind of transferred to another group, he became a slave. And when he encountered the other Spaniards, they were slaves to the groups they were in. But then along this way, trying to get away from there, they were kind of Cabeza de Vaca initially didn't want to try to do anything in the way of healing, but they started withholding their food to get him to do it, and so he did it, and it seemed to work. It's what we would call now the placebo effect.
Or you could say it's a miracle.
Well, you could say that. Yes, right? That's true. You could. Further along, and I didn't even know about this, although he experienced what is called the nocebo effect. It's the other side of the coin to the placebo effect is a good outcome or a good result from an action that should have had no effect. The nocebo effect is just the opposite. It's a bad outcome based upon expectations. And I think voodoo is an example of a nocebo effect. The way it turned up in Cabeza de Vaca, they were out pretty far west, and they were trying to get somebody to lead them on, and the Indians they were with didn't want to do that, and so Cabeza de Vaca got angry, and over the night, 8 of the Indians died, fearing that the anger that Cabeza de Vaca was displaying was going to bring bad results. And so they died, and some others got sick as well. And so he was quite surprised by that. I mean, that was,
unless they were just so sensitive to in their socialization, etc. They're so sensitive to the way other people think about them or anger.
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, I guess
it's interesting.
It has to do with their beliefs, and so it is. You might think, well, gee, that kind of makes sense, because if you believe, well, of course they didn't know what was going on. Cabeza de Vaca was mystified by all this. But, you know, if you...
Well, did he have an elevated position as a Western person from a foreign land? Would he have an elevated position to them? Can you tell?
I never saw that, but it would seem like that would be the case.
Okay.
That may be why he was asked to do it in the first place. But he would never have made... They actually got such a reputation that they drew crowds around them. It was making it difficult for them to move. And so it really helped because the people were providing food and guides and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so without his, let's call it faith healing, they may not have ever made it back.
Okay. The other big thing you see amongst a political group in the United States now is the Spaniards came to steal the gold. That's why they came. Did Cabeza de Vaca, is that what brought him here? Was he affiliated with a Spanish Navy? Did he come here to steal gold? Did the Carancuas have any gold to steal?
No, they certainly had no gold to steal. The early Spanish expeditions, Coronado and others, I think were here. They were looking for El Dorado. The later ones, Cabeza de Vaca was...
Okay, what is El Dorado?
It was a town... a mythical town,
right.
Streets paved with gold, etc. The group that Cabeza de Vaca was with, I can't remember the name of the guy that was heading it up, but it actually landed over in Florida and spent some time exploring on the ground in Florida. And then they they made some boats. I'm not sure what happened to their ships, but they were stranded there, so they kind of made some boats, and they were headed for Mexico in these boats when they got washed. So that was the original group was like 400 or 500 strong, and then that's where the 80 ended up on. I don't know. I mean, sure they would have picked up gold, but they weren't looking for it, in the places where they did. Particularly out of Mexico. The expeditions out of Mexico, like Coronado, I think they really did have gold in mind. I don't know that was so true of the group that Cabeza de Vaca was with.
Okay, what was the group that Cabeza de Vaca, what did he want to do? Just occupy parts of the,
I think
of the north?
Yeah, they were trying to claim the whole Gulf Coast for Spain, and they did. I mean, at one time, they were claiming the Gulf Coast from Florida down into Mexico. And then later on, in the 1800s, basically, they traded it away, Florida, as part of some treaty. And then, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte became kind of ruler of France and Spain, and then he sold Louisiana to the United States about 1805.
So Cabeza de Vaca, he's walking around. Is he walking around? Is he taking a horse? He's in slavery.
He's walking everywhere.
He's walking everywhere.
He's walking everywhere, and
if you've been to parts of Texas,
no clothes. I mean, the clothes of long. I mean, whatever he's wearing is about like what the Indians were.
And then Spain isn't trying to get him any money, or he's not reporting back, or it's just he's out there.
No, he went. I mean, he and his companions, the 3 other guys, they literally walked back to Mexico, and when they got to Mexico, this is on the Pacific coast, they knew they were near Spaniards because they found the Spaniards there enslaving the Indians to work in silver mines or something like that. But Cabeza de Vaca eventually went back to Spain, and he wrote his account about 3 or 4 years later, and that's what all of this comes from.
And I guess it was called La Relacion, or the
That's
report.
Right.
Is that
That's
right?
Yeah,
And did you read the report?
Yes, I read it in translation. Yes.
Okay. And how long is the report?
It's not that long. It's about 50 pages long.
Okay, and so if we want to read about these adventures, I guess we could do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually been several translations of it, but it's very readable.
Okay, and what about? I think you had also considered yourself fairly well read on La Salle, correct?
I've read everything I can find on LaSalle.
And why was that?
Say, why was it?
Yeah, why was that?
Well, because he was the second European that the Indians of Texas saw. I mean, Cabeza de Vaca was the first, but of course not all the Indians saw him, and not all the Indians saw LaSalle either. And so there was a long time, 1528 to 1685, where nothing happened here. I mean, some ships may have gone along the coast, but there were no Europeans in Texas.
And LaSalle was from France, is that correct?
Yeah. Now, LaSalle in France wanted to get a claim to Texas, and so that's why LaSalle came here. The story was, I mean, LaSalle actually discovered or came all the way down the Mississippi to the mouth. And then when he came with this expedition...
And where does the mouth of the Mississippi end?
New Orleans.
Okay.
I mean, around where New Orleans is now. However, it's got such a big delta. It's actually, apparently, it's kind of hard to see from the sea. I mean, it's not like you've got this huge mouth. I mean, it comes through in a bunch of little streams. Anyway, LaSalle at some point said, well, I'm heading for the Mississippi. Well, he overshot the Mississippi and went to Matagorda Bay. Now, there's other... It's not really clear. It's kind of like maybe he really had in mind to go to the Western Gulf and try to find the Spanish silver mines, which are in northern Mexico, and rob them. So LaSalle...
Well, yeah, that's interesting. That would fall into what a lot of the...
Well, here's one thing that supports that. LaSalle gets there, and with great effort, they set up this camp. Mm-hmm. And so the first trip that LaSalle takes out of there is to the west. Mm-hmm. And he got about as far as, there's not very good records of that, but he got about as far as the Rio Grande River. And so you might think, well, gee, was he really, did he think the Mississippi was that far west? I mean, they didn't have good maps then. They had no good way of doing longitude, but still, it does kind of support the idea that LaSalle may have been looking for the Mexican silver mine, Spanish silver mine.
He had some religious background, didn't he?
He had a brother, I think, who was a monk. Mm-hmm. I don't know.
I had read something about that he was a Jesuit and he studied with them for a while.
Well, that certainly could be. Yeah. Now LaSalle was. He did a lot of exploring up around the Great Lakes, and he took a canoe trip down the Mississippi, from way up there down to the mouth, and then returned. And the group that he was with that killed LaSalle,
he returned up the
Mississippi, and then back to France, up to like French Canada. I mean. So it was Is there any indication that
did he write about his journeys or trips? Do you know? Did LaSalle write about his?
No, he did not.
And is there any indication that he went back to France real wealthy?
No, I don't think so. I think he was. When he went back, he was trying to get the king to finance another expedition, and that's the one that was supposed to go to the mouth of the Mississippi.
So it almost sounds like, for example, these men followed a pattern fairly similar to maybe even Christopher Columbus, wherein they would come, they'd explore, they'd go back, etc.
Yeah, and I think that they were what LaSalle tried to sell the King of France on was, give me some money, I'll go over there and, we'll claim this country on the Gulf, for France. After LaSalle, the rest of LaSalle's group, they killed him, and then they went on to the Mississippi, and they followed that path. They went up the Mississippi to northern part of the United States and Canada, and back to France, and then they told a kind of a tall tale about, what happened to LaSalle and all that.
Why did they kill LaSalle? And where did they kill him?
Well, they don't know exactly. Someplace in East Texas.
I had read. Was it Huntsville? Was that possible? No.
I don't think, I think it's maybe a little bit east of there,
Okay.
but I mean, they don't know exactly where, because the guys were trying to cover their tracks. And some of those that did the killing were themselves killed by other members. So we're talking about just a survivor group that finally made it back to France. Now, France knew, I mean, they told the King of France, let's say, what had happened. And so then France started trying to send expeditions back to find out where La Salle's colony was so they could claim it. And so that happened in 1720. There were a number of French expeditions, but basically they could never find where La Salle's colony was. One of them went past Matagorda Bay, came into Aransas Bay.
Do you have a chapter in your book, Texas Gulf Stories, about La Salle?
Yeah, I think I have several in there. I think the one expedition I entitled, I'd have to look at it now. The French mapped Aransas Bay, but they didn't know where they were. They kind of thought they were where La Salle's colony was, but they never could find any evidence of it. So the French expeditions trying to find La Salle's colony, like 2 or 3 of them ended up in Galveston, and one of them went, so they undershot the mark in Galveston and overshot the mark to Aransas Bay, but they never actually went into Matagorda Bay.
I see you have a chapter here, Early Missions, Ports and Towns, and again in your book, Texas Gulf Stories, Early Missions, Ports and Towns.
Yeah.
So what about our missions close here? What about the Goliad, etc.? What are our missions close to?
I've
Corpus
looked
Christi,
into
Texas?
those a lot. There is a mission, the last mission established by the. I'll come back to your question in just a minute. The last mission that the Spanish established in Texas was the Refugio mission. And it moved several times, but it ended up in Refugio in 1795.
And how much of it is left?
Well, absolutely nothing is left.
And I've never seen anything. Is there a marker there?
I guess as a marker. That's one of my research projects. I'm trying to reconstruct what it looked like.
I would assume that it looked very similar to many of the missions, like the Goliad mission. Weren't they all very similar?
That's what I thought too when I started, but no.
That's not true. Okay.
There are some words written about it, but there's no sketch of it. And there's hardly any description of what it looked like.
And aren't the missions around San Antonio fairly similar?
Now those I would say are probably more similar to each other. Actually, if I had to make, in terms of a rough approximation, I think that the church in Refugio looks something like the Loretta Chapel in the Presidio in Goliad. There's 2 things in Goliad. There's the mission and the Presidio.
Yes, but one of them was rebuilt pretty much, right?
They both were.
Oh, okay.
and that mission and Presidio started at the site of La Salle's colony. The Spanish put it there because they wanted to stake the flag, right there where La Salle was and say this is our. But it migrated over about 50 years, let's say. In fact, they started that mission in about 1690, but it ended up in Goliad in 1745. And what they've got there is the mission on one side of the north side of the river and the Presidio on the south side of the river. The mission fell into ruins. All of the missions, all the Spanish missions were pretty much abandoned and secularized by 1824, 1825. The Presidio, the fort, it fell into ruins too, except for the Loretta Chapel. There's a fort, and then there's a chapel in the fort, and that's called the Loretta Chapel. And it actually survived. It's pretty. There's pictures of it Well, the oldest pictures are back in the early 1900s.
And is this where they still say Mass or have
yes,
service
that's right.
today?
That's correct.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, right. It's right on. It's on one side of the Presidio.
I think they might state that it's some sort of longest continual Mass.
I think so, and this probably may well be true because the Loretto Chapel has been there for a long time. So that mission in Presidio was earlier.
So what's a mission?
Well, the mission is where the Indians lived and they received religious instructions from the missionaries. And the Presidio was
Who were the missionaries? Where were they from? What was their religious affiliation?
They were Franciscans out of Mexico, out of Zacatecas in Mexico. That's where their head house was.
All the missions? All the missions, San Antonio, etc., San Juan Capistrano, were all from there?
I think so. Now, there was some competition. I mean, the Jesuits were involved. And I think the Benedictines might have been involved. But the ones in Texas, I think, and Arizona and California could be different also. But the ones in Texas were all Franciscan missions.
There is a historical belief now among certain political groups that the idea that was part of it was a Western domination. Besides slaughtering these Indians, there was a follow-up by the missionaries, or it included the Western missionaries in an attempt to somehow, dominate this region. Is that a politically? Would you say that is politically correct, or would you not care to get involved in politics? It's interesting because I always hear it from my liberal friends.
All right. I don't agree with the genocide thing, but the missionary mindset of the Spaniards, and it was true for Mexico and South America and here, is that they wanted to Christianize the Indians. They considered the Indians to be savages and heathens and so forth, and the best thing they could do for them was to Christianize them. Well,
so the motives were good.
Among the missionaries, yeah, the military part had other things in mind, but the missionaries generally had their motives were good. Their motives were pure. That's a broad generalization.
Right. We're talking generally, and we're talking about your opinion. I don't know,
but in retrospect, what they were offering was a complete, just the thing of Christianization. It involved a complete change of lifestyle from the people being hunter-gatherers to them being agriculture-based, and also from living individually or in small camps to living in missions or small towns and so. So it wasn't just the acceptance of Christianity that was the problem. It was a complete change of culture,
a complete socialization.
Yeah,
process we're in. You're going to maybe a jump of I don't know how many generations at once.
Yeah,
an exposure at once.
By way of contrast, there were no French missionaries down here. But I'm not an expert on this, but I understand that in northeastern United States and Canada, French missionaries tended to go live in the village of the people they were trying to convert. So that's very different than building a mission, which is a place inside of a wall, and saying, okay, all you guys come and live in here. So that is another approach, but it wasn't the Spanish approach. The Spanish approach was the mission, and then the Presidio. Not every mission had a Presidio. The one in Refugio didn't have a Presidio.
And what's a Presidio?
It's a fort.
Okay, so some of the missions had forts and some of them didn't.
Yeah.
So apparently they felt that they had to have a fort to protect themselves from who? Other Indians?
Yeah.
Whatever, Native
Comanches were a big problem of raiding into this area. They did not live, they only lived kind of like in very North Texas, Oklahoma, and points north, but they raided into this area a lot. And so the fort was a way of protecting the mission against raiding Indians. There wasn't anybody else. I mean, if somebody else had thought to do something, then the forts might afford some protection. But you know, you go to Goliad and you think, well, hey, if the fort, the Presidio, is supposed to protect the mission, why'd they put it on different sides of the San Antonio River? I mean, that's, you know, you could come in and raid the mission and be gone by the time the soldiers learned about it, got down to the river, got across the river, and came to the mission.
So why did they?
From what I understand, again, it had to do with this difference between the military and the missionary. The soldiers were bad influences on the Indians. Tried to take advantage of them and in various ways. And so I guess they put the river between them to try to keep the soldiers away from the Indians, except when they maybe were needed.
I see in your book you have a chapter, John Lafitte's treasure is buried at False Live Oak Point. So let's go, is that where it is? Could I find it?
Well, I would imagine a lot of people have looked. There is a first-person account, only one person that is, who, after Lafitte was chased out of Galveston by American and British warships, that they came into Matagorda Bay and kind of rendezvoused there, and Lafitte said, I'm getting out of the pirating business, we're going to divide up the loot, and he said apparently he was going to bury his, and this first person account says, yeah, they took 5 days or something, and it would be in the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge now. False Live Oak Point is over around there, but and then on the last night, Lafitte came out by himself. He killed all the other people. Now,
he killed all the other people.
He killed the people that helped him bury it, so that he was the only one that knew where it was, but he never made it back. He didn't give up pirating either.
So he was a pirate. Where did he pirate at?
The Gulf, Caribbean.
Okay, so he would just board these ships, murder everybody, take the loot. How'd this work?
I don't know whether he murdered everybody, but he was certainly after the loot. And he was, I think he was killed off of... There's a bunch of legends about how he died. And supposedly, he said he was going to the Yucatan to retire, but it seems the most likely thing is that he was actually killed in a firefight with a couple of Spanish warships. But in any case, I mean, this is one of those stories you read it and you say, I ought to be able to find it, you know? I mean, I know where he was tied up, and that is where the ships were tied up. Go out there with a metal detector, you know, and, well, it might take you a year or two, you know.
So he was French, I guess? Is that right?
Yeah, he was. But as far as I know, nobody has ever found it. But it's the only treasure story that I found that is documented is the 3 Spanish treasure ships that sank off of Padre Island in 1544.
Which part of Padre Island? By us or further south?
No, by Port Mansfield.
By Port Mansfield, there were 3 ships. Did they ever find any of them?
Yes, they did. They found them at the time. I mean, the Spaniards came out of Mexico, did a salvage operation, very thorough. Now, the ships were still there, but they were looking for the gold and silver, mostly silver. And they did everything they could at the time, but they didn't have a good inventory, so they didn't really know what was there. But there was some estimate, you know, well, they may have gotten 40 or 50% of it. But those coins those are the coins that have been washing up on the beach, you know, South Padre Island for a long time. At 1544, right? Yeah, oh yeah.
So you'll still see them periodically?
Well, I think it's pretty rare now, but they were. I mean, I'm sure there have been thousands of people with metal detectors down.
What other kind of remnants would we have from those cultures in the 1500s or the Karankawas or whatever? Do people find arrowheads in this area? Do they find anything else that is? I know occasionally they'll be digging and they'll find burial grounds, etc.
There are burial grounds. Bones in general are rather rare. They find stone points, arrowheads and spear points. There's not much else. Later on, by later on would be maybe around 1800 or so, the Karankawas begin to make a certain type of pottery. And so you can find pottery shards certain places. And they were working with tools made out of bone and shell. They were working, with whatever they could get their hands on. Stone for arrowheads is kind of rare down here. A lot of it up in Central.
You don't really see, bricks and stones aren't this
right.
This area geographically doesn't seem to have.
Right. There is apparently some small source of it in the upper Nueces River. You go 30 miles upriver, then you can find some source. All of the stone points are made with a type of stone that's called chert, which is the same as flint. Flint and chert, same names, different names for the same stone, and that's what's used to make all stone arrowheads. But before that they used sharpened bone, sharpened wood, whatever.
Okay. So we don't see a lot of remnants. It looks like, what would you bring to Texas in 1825? You note a lot of rifles, pistols, gunpowder, shot and flint, 100 pounds, iron tools, plow, axes, adze, shovels, hammers, nails, and saws, 300 pounds, household goods, etc., 150 pounds.
I got to thinking about that question, and so I started researching and trying to find if I could find that, did anybody actually have a list, of what they brought. I couldn't find anything, so I just started thinking, well, what would I bring, The one thing that I found that's where that list is wrong, the people that immigrated here, certainly the Anglo-Europeans, they were mostly farmers, and not every one of them had a gun or brought a gun. Not every one of them that got here knew that there were Indians here.
That's interesting. An interesting story.
If you come directly from Ireland to here, which some of them did, then you wouldn't know that there were Indians here.
Yeah, you may not know that it was that kind of environment.
Yeah.
Mr. Williams, we're reaching the end of our shows. I wanted to thank you for coming on, author of Texas Gulf Coast Stories, which I guess is available for sale. Various places.
It's at Barnes & Noble, and it's also on Amazon.com.
Wanted to thank you again for coming on. Mr. Herndon Williams, local historian. Maybe you can come on again. Do me a favor.
Well, the hour passed very fast.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Concerning some wild cowboys who did agree to go spend the summer pleasant on the trail of the buffalo. Found myself in Griffin in the spring of '83 when a well-known famous drover come a-walking up to me. Said, "How do you do, young fellow? Well, how'd you like to go spend the summer pleasant on the trail of the buffalo?" Well, I being out of work right then, to the drover I did say, "Going out on the buffalo road depends upon your pay. If you pay good wages, transportation to and fro, think I might go with you on the hunt of buffalo. Of course, I'll pay good wages and transportation too. You'll agree to work for me until the season's through. But if you do get home..."